Senior Vice President for Strategic Initiatives at the Atlantic Council, and I'm also the Director of the Adrian Arsh Latin America Center. Thank you for joining us in this very timely event. And it's timely because two of the three members of the President's National Security Cabinet are traveling to Mexico this week. But it is also timely because we're in imminent danger of dismantling the North American experiment that we've built with Mexico and with Canada in the past 25 years. It's a mystery to me, and I suspect it's a mystery to many of you, how we got to this point of profound recrimination when in fact Mexico and the North American integration experiment of the past 25 years have been a huge foreign policy success. Today, the US-Mexican border is the world's largest border of a developing country with an industrialized nation. And instead of tension and recrimination and reproach, the North American experiment has fostered a stable, safe boundary connected by trade, culture, and history, and $1.5 billion crosses the Rio Grande every day. Mexico and Canada are now two of our top three trading partners. NAFTA supports 14 million jobs in the United States. Combined, Canada and Mexico invested nearly $400 billion in the United States in 2015. And progress is not only commercial. The past 2 decades created a unique era of trust between our nations that has brought unprecedented security cooperation, intelligence sharing, anti-narcotics enforcement, anti-terrorism security happen daily. And proof of the reality of this partnership is found at Mexico's border with Guatemala, where at our request, Mexico's efforts to stem the flow of Central American refugees take an enormous burden off our border patrol. Today's rhetoric is forcing Mexicans everywhere to question the unquestionable. Did the country make a mistake 25 years ago by betting its future on North America? We saw massive marches last weekend against the United States. The leftist candidate, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, has locked in the top spot in national polls. If we continue to antagonize Mexico, we risk our neighbor turning its back on us and turning its back on decades of strategic cooperation. Today, as the two secretaries arrive in Mexico, and in the coming months, this center will continue to play a constructive role in suggesting ways to move this relationship forward. On March 7th, we will welcome Margarita Zavala, a leading candidate for president, and former Secretary Michael Chertoff to discuss strategies for the future. And as we kick off today's discussion about the way forward, nobody can begin to do that job better than a very distinguished guest, a dear friend, and somebody who knows a thing or two about trade and US jobs, Secretary Carlos Gutierrez. Thank you, Carlos, for opening this event. The Secretary's remarks will be followed by a panel discussion captained by my dear colleague and our center's director of the Latin American Economic Growth Initiative, Jason Marzak. We're lucky to have a panel of impressive experts. Paula Stern, our Atlantic Council board member and former chairwoman of the International Trade Commission, Peter MacKay, a good friend and former Defense, Justice, and Foreign Minister of Canada, and finally, Rafael Fernandez de Castro, professor at Mexico City's ITAM and the Maxwell School for Citizenship and Public Affairs. Secretary Gutierrez needs no introduction, but very quickly, he served as Secretary of Commerce from 2005 to 2009 under President George W. Bush. During his time there, he helped advance economic relationships, enhance trade, promote U.S. exports. Secretary Gutierrez is now chair of the Albright Stonebridge Group. Previously, Secretary Gutierrez spent nearly 30 years with the Kellogg Company, a global manufacturer and marketer of well-known food brands, becoming its president and chief executive officer in 1999, the youngest CEO in the company's 100-year history. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Secretary Carlos Gutierrez.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for having me on this very timely meeting. It's a pleasure to be here with Peter MacKay, Paula Stern. I want to thank Peter Schechter and Jason Marzak for the invitation. The discussion today is about NAFTA, but we know that there's a a big elephant in the room that's called immigration policy. And I'm not going to get into that, but I think it's important that we just realize that we're talking about our free trade agreement with Mexico and Canada. And the backdrop is this new immigration executive order that should be finalized very soon. I think all the details are out, but that's going to add a level of complexity to this that I don't think we are fully acknowledging. Peter's going to discuss a lot of Canada and the Canadian context. I'm going to focus mostly on Mexico because it seems like that is the epicenter of what's going on here. It's important to step back, and I know that we're going to talk a lot about the details and whether we renegotiate or whether we update, and whether it's the labor chapter or the environmental chapter and rules of origin, and those are very important things, obviously. But I want to step back a little bit because there's a lot more at stake than just the rules of origin and who wins or loses on a specific product category. We're talking about a big strategic issue. I remember being in Mexico City a couple of years ago and just thinking about how the relationship has evolved and how there's a certain confidence in the relationship whereby it's becoming somewhat bilingual, bicultural. There are English words that have just creeped into the Mexican, to the Spanish language in Mexico. There are Spanish words that have creeped into the U.S. language, cultures, food, you name it. The relationship has never been better. This is what was on my mind. Today, you're talking about a level of anxiety in Mexico that we can't see from here. We hear about it, we read the papers, but there isn't anyone in Mexico who isn't thinking about what's going on. So we've worked very hard to get here, and that relationship today is at risk. And I think what we need to understand, and I trust that our government here in the U.S. will understand this, we cannot humiliate a country to the bargaining table. We can't get a country to negotiate with us by humiliating them. Maybe in business you can because it's all about the bottom line, but you can't quantify national pride. You can't quantify national dignity, and that's what's at stake here. And it's going to be extremely difficult for Mexico to do anything but take a combative response, take a combative position. And in many ways, it's our position and our tactics that have forced Mexico into a corner, and they have no option. We have given them no option. And it's not going to be an easy task, and I wouldn't push Mexico on that. I wouldn't call their bluff, because you know as well as I do that if this means going into a recession for a couple of years, but we're going to keep our national sovereignty and dignity, that will happen. And I would hate to even test it. So we are creating the conditions for a presidential election in 2018 in Mexico, where the winner could well be an anti-American, populist, anti-imperialist, what have you, in Mexico. Something we haven't seen in decades, decades, and decades. That would be a strategic issue. And we need to have the wisdom to not go for a tactical victory that down the road we'll realize that it was a strategic defeat. And you know, the motivation for a quick tactical victory is always there. I just hope we have the wisdom to look down the road a little bit. I started my career in Mexico, so for me, it's a country I know very well. I was actually general manager of Kellogg Mexico from 1983 to 1988, before NAFTA. I remember that in Mexico extremely well. We're talking about very nationalist policies, protectionist in many, many ways. Products that are imported today we couldn't import back then. A sense that things had to be nationalistic, that they we not open but very nationalistic. And being on the corporate side of things, you could see the impact that that had on our ability to create jobs. 100% inflation. A lot of people have forgotten that. But during that period when I managed the business, we had about 100% inflation on average. Uh, Low growth rate, so high inflation, low growth rate, and we all remember this boom bust cycle where approximately once every 6 years there'd be a major devaluation. That major devaluation would have devastating impacts on border towns, on border states, on jobs in the U.S., on jobs in Mexico, on corporate balance sheets and corporate earnings, which in turn led to more downsizing and just a terrible, vicious cycle. We haven't seen that. We haven't seen that for about 20 years. And that coincides with the NAFTA period. Today, what the three countries have built is really quite breathtaking. NAFTA is worth over $1 trillion, well over $1 trillion. Uh, Supply chains have been integrated throughout the three countries. Manufacturing supply chains and agricultural supply chains going on both sides of the border, being able to get produce to the countries on time so that it doesn't rot. We know how to do that. We can do that because we've been building this infrastructure for over 20 years. Logistics operations on both sides, computer systems. The NAFTA is digital. And the computer systems that have been also integrated across the three countries to consolidate information, all the things that you need to do to work the supply chain, to forecast sales, to invoice a customer. It's not like switching off a light that all of a sudden NAFTA goes away. These are billions and billions of dollars that have been invested in this infrastructure that we call NAFTA. 14 million U.S. jobs are tied to NAFTA. 14 million U.S. jobs. So as we approach this, we need to keep that in mind. Geographic proximity always makes a difference. And you would expect that Mexico is the main export market for the majority of U.S. companies. And let me just explain that a second. 57,000 U.S. companies export to Mexico. Of those 57,000 companies, 94% are small and medium sized. So you're talking about, and this is the essence of geographic proximity. If you start exporting, you might as well export to your neighbor. So a lot of jobs, a lot is at stake. I was hearing this morning, if you just take one example of the trickle effect and kind of the domino effect of something like this, we receive exports of avocados and tomatoes from Mexico. So a lot of families are working in that industry, and the U.S. is a great market. Those are high value agricultural items. But they also happen to be in the states of Michoacan and Sinaloa. These are the states where we have seen the drug crime, and we've seen the impact of organized crime in Mexico. What are those families going to do if they're out of a job? If you can't find a job in the avocado business, if you can't find a job in the tomato business, where else do you go? So we just have to keep thinking about and connecting dots and understanding that this is a lot bigger than how much are we paying for Mexican goods, or how much are they paying for U.S. goods, and how much are they buying, and how much are we buying. Canada and Mexico. are the top customers for U.S. products. So we are, we're dealing with the biggest thing we've got going. The world is regionalized. We keep talking about globalization and how globalization has hurt everyone. It is still very much a regional world. The EU, in spite of Brexit, and one of the problems with Brexit, of course, is that the EU is the biggest market for British goods. Why? Because of geographic proximity, because they're there. Today, in Asia, China is leading the way toward what they call RCEP. Some people call it ASEAN plus 3 or ASEAN plus 4. The 10 Southeast Asian countries plus Korea, Japan, and China in one big trading bloc. Without the U.S., without the U.S. dollar. That's the vision. It may not happen for 7 years, for 10 years, but today, as we speak, they're building roads going down through Vietnam, Laos, from China. They're getting ready. So let's look at the Americas. We are fragmented. We're splintered. There's, aside from NAFTA, there's CAFTA, ALBA, CELAC, Mercosur, you name it, the Pacific Alliance. There are a lot of different things, but there isn't one Americas. The crown jewel that we do have is NAFTA. And I hope that we also think about the role that our region plays as we are competing with other regions in the world. We would much rather have jobs stay here in the hemisphere than go to Asia. And that is a reality. And it becomes an economic reality, and it becomes a national security reality. And again, I hope we keep that in mind. Energy supply chains, we have the opportunity to see a massive shift of wealth from the east to the west if we could get our act together regionally and build energy supply chains. We have the oil, we have the gas. And this is the time when we can be doing that. This is a time when we can be negotiating that. By 2050, Mexico will be the 7th largest economy in the world. The 7th largest economy in the world, our southern neighbor. And Canada will always be one of the most developed per capita income economies anywhere. So NAFTA is not only important today, but it will get more and more important. NAFTA should be updated, okay? Let's agree to that. The market has changed. The world has changed in 23 years. So yes, the labor chapter, the environmental chapter, we probably should look at rules of origin. Think about, NAFTA was signed before the internet took over the world, right? So think about the digital economy, online marketplaces, the cloud, the app economy, the Internet of Things. This is an area we can have, the U.S. can have a significant advantage if we can get to a point where we can negotiate a better agreement where it's not a zero-sum game, where one party wins, the other party loses. That's not what trade has been all about. It's been about growing the market. So I think the question that I would hope that we're asking as we go into these talks, whenever they start to happen, how do we make NAFTA stronger for all 3 countries? And how does North America better compete with the rest of the world? Those are really the 2 strategic questions. Everything else, I think, is tactics and politics and, sort of appealing to the political circumstances in individual countries. I think we should be working on bilateral agreements with Mexico on immigration. We should be working on bilateral agreements and trilateral agreements on border security. I had the opportunity to work with President Cedillo on a major study that we did to come up with a bilateral agreement for low-skilled workers from Mexico. Because right now, low-skilled workers have to go to a black market. So we're essentially just outsourcing the labor that our companies need to a black market. Why not negotiate some kind of an agreement? Those are the things that I think are possible. Those are the things that I think we should be focused on if we have the right attitude, and not this idea that we're going to win and they're going to lose, or we're going to show them, or we're going to put our foot down. It's We know from history, and history looms large in our relationship with Mexico, that that's not going to work. So I want to thank all of you for your interest in this. I want to thank you for your leadership. I want to thank you for your commitment. But above all, I hope that we can be a voice of wisdom as this process starts, because there's an awful lot at stake, not just for next year, but 10, 20 years down the road. Thank you very much for being here. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Very good job, huh? Congratulations.
Outstanding. Really, that's the best recitation of the entire situation. Very well done. Really.
Thank you, Secretary Gutierrez, for taking the time again to be with us today, and Secretary, for your important leadership on this topic at such a pivotal moment. Thank you very much for your comments and your insights. And thanks to all of you for joining us today for this incredibly timely and important discussion. I'm Jason Marzak, the director of the Adrian Arch Latin America Center's Latin America Economic Growth Initiative, and I'm going to be captaining the rest of our discussion today with these three esteemed panelists who are on the stage. The timing of our discussion today really couldn't be more on the mark. As Peter mentioned at the outset, tonight, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and Secretary of Homeland Security John Kelly will arrive in Mexico with a objective of trying to calm the waters. I'm sure we can all guess what will be part of the topics in tomorrow's meetings: security, migration, the economy, border issues. But of course, this will be against a backdrop where a once constructive relationship is now under threat. And politics especially on both sides of the border now, will be as important as policy, or potentially more important, in finding common ground. And it comes just over a week after Prime Minister Trudeau came to Washington, a visit that again raised questions if one potential casualty of this new U.S. approach could be broader North American integration. That would, of course, be a huge loss, from U.S. jobs lost to our strategic footing weakened. Intertwining the three North American economies simply keeps us safer, as we'll discuss today. And we have an all-star panel to do so. Beginning on your right, Peter MacKay. Peter is someone who I've had the pleasure of working with for the past few years, and I can say that every good thing you've heard about Peter is correct. He is one of Canada's premier thought leaders who has held an impressive number of posts in the Canadian government. This includes serving as the Minister of Defense for 6 years and as Minister of Foreign Affairs for a year and a half. Most recently, he was Canada's Attorney General and Minister of Justice until November 2015. Peter is currently a partner in the Baker McKenzie Toronto office, a firm with which we have had the good fortune to collaborate with on a number of different conferences and events. Thanks, Peter, for coming down for this. Next to Peter is Paula Stern. Paula is the founder and chairwoman of the Stern Group, which she founded in 1988. She's also truly a wealth of knowledge, and I'm privileged to call Paula a dear colleague, as Paula serves on the Atlantic Council's board of directors. As far as trade goes, I think it's hard to find someone with both the experience and expertise of Paula. That's why she's always one of my first calls on any trade-related matters. Paula served as chairwoman of the U.S. International Trade Commission and as commissioner for 9 years, analyzing and voting on over 1,000 trade cases involving a broad range of industries and issues. And sitting next to me is Rafael Fernandez de Castro. Rafael is a professor at both Mexico City's ITAM and also Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. Rafael, you're really the ultimate expression of a strong U.S.-Mexico relationship. I've had the pleasure to know Rafael, work with him for a number of years. He's a prolific writer as well, having written and co-edited more than 30 books on Mexico-U.S. relations, U.S.-Latin American relations, and Mexico's foreign policy. So definitely somebody who knows what he's talking about. Rafael was also a foreign policy advisor to former President Felipe Calderon. So thank you all very much for joining us. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to spend the next half hour or so taking a deep dive on a number of different issues, beginning with tomorrow's meetings in Mexico, and then moving on to North American linkages as a whole, the future of NAFTA, short to long-term repercussions of today's environment, and the path forward. And we're going to leave plenty of time for questions from everybody who is joining us here today. So it's a lot to cover, and I've asked the panelists to keep comments short and warn them that if the comments go long, I'll jump in to keep the conversation flowing, since it's a lot of ground to cover. Let's start off with tomorrow's visit. Actually, that both secretaries arrive in Mexico City tonight. Border security, law enforcement, cooperation, and trade are going to be at the top of the agenda with their counterpart meetings in Mexico. They'll be meeting with President Peña Nieto, as well as the secretaries of Interior, Foreign Relations, Finance, and National Defense. Perhaps, Peter, starting off with you, given the new low in the relationship, and I think President Trump's personal interest in driving this agenda, what do you think can be realistically accomplished at this point?
Well, firstly, I think I want to thank Peter and yourself and the Atlantic Council for the invitation. I think, firstly, it's been clear to us from a Canadian perspective that the President's quite serious criticisms of NAFTA have been very much aimed, undoubtedly, in the direction of Mexico. The visit of President Trump with Prime Minister Trudeau here last week, I think, demonstrated that the word that he used was tweak, not tweet. Right. Tweak when it comes to the relationship, and people jump when he tweets. With respect to your question in this upcoming meeting, I think it's an opportunity to maybe step back. And the U.S. officials, Tillerson and Kelly, who are going, have an opportunity to hone in on legitimate concerns around security. And I think if they go back to the basics of the security as being perhaps the primary concern that's been expressed by this administration, that may allow them to, I dare say, rethink some of the rhetoric, particularly around the wall, and I fully expect we'll have a discussion on the wall. And at the same time, I think it will allow Mexican counterparts to make a very strong case for the continuation of this unprecedented relationship here in North America. How integral it is to the success of all of our countries from an economic perspective, but from an overall quality of life perspective. Let's go back to basics here. To make America great again, you have to make NAFTA great again. And so I agree with many of the comments, all of the comments, frankly, of Secretary Guterres, who spoke of the need to modernize this agreement. And so I think this opening salvo in this visit tomorrow is a tremendous opportunity to recast what has perhaps been a wrong-footed approach and go back to the basics of security, improving some of the concerns that do exist in an agreement that is 23 years old when it comes to NAFTA, and not retrench or double down on some of the rhetoric, but really hone in on just how important NAFTA is. And I know that was part of the approach that Prime Minister Trudeau took last week when he was here in Washington.
Paul, what do you on the trade front? Obviously, Secretary Guajardo is not part of these discussions tomorrow. So what do you? And trade is in addition to the wall and border issues and law enforcement cooperation is obviously front and center. What do you see being realistically accomplished tomorrow on that level, whether it's behind the scenes? What do you see as far as maybe potentially public statements that could come out? Obviously taking into account the fact that the folks that are traveling from the U.S. side are our Homeland Security Secretary and our Secretary of State.
Well, I'm glad you asked about trade because we heard about one elephant in the room, which was immigration in the opening statement. But I really think the elephant in the room is trade. So maybe there are two elephants here. But at least
so it's a big
the fact is the President of the United States of America ran successfully on a trade agenda. He said two things that he wanted to get done. One, he wanted to reduce the trade deficits, and the second, he wanted to throw out those, quote, dumb agreements that were made by, quote, stupid officials. And NAFTA was numero uno in the list, and said on day one he would move against both the NAFTA and the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which had not yet been ratified by Congress, but had been negotiated. Now, he did that with the TPP, and with NAFTA, it's very clear. He's had discussions already with the Mexican president. Those phone calls and personal conversations went badly. And I think that the mission of the two secretaries from the United States who were going there, Tillerson and Kelly, is to try to smooth and deal with the backlash, the nationalistic backlash, which is making President Peña Nieto's position even more difficult to negotiate a new NAFTA. So it's one is to just kind of smooth down the feathers. The other thing I would like our secretaries to do in this visit is to put the trade issue in a context. And I think we should do that here, as a matter of fact, as well, as thinking folks. Trade agreements are a subset of trade policy. Trade policy is microeconomics. What drives the trade deficits, what drives the disruption that comes from competition, globalization, technological change, which has affected our voters and disaffected our voters and made them anxious, is all these other matters that are both macroeconomic as well as technological. And so we need to put this NAFTA agreement, which is old and needs fixing, into a proper context economically. Otherwise, we are, as a nation, and with our neighbors, Canada and Mexico, we'll find ourselves in a impoverished, reduced state, lower growth, lower productivity, and we will not be gaining on the competition with the rest of the world that we had enjoyed.
Yeah. I think you make an excellent point of what can be accomplished by Tillerson and Kelly specifically with regard to trade. And one of those is smoothing over, as you said, the nationalist backlash. And as Secretary Gutierrez mentioned in the beginning, that you can't humiliate a country to the bargaining table, and we can't underestimate national pride in Mexico, so the extent to which they can do it. And I think also important to emphasize that these are two men who know Mexico very well, who have deep relationships with the Mexican government from Secretary Tillerson's time as head of ExxonMobil and Secretary Kelly's time as the head of U.S. Southern Command. And that these agreements, trade agreements, are also strategic agreements. Our first agreement was with Israel, not because of the importance necessarily of the Israeli economy to the United States, but the strategic imperative of that. Rafael, Paula mentioned the political environment that exists in Mexico right now, the political environment that Secretary Tillerson and Kelly will see when they arrive in Mexico City tonight. If you could compare the political tenor between the two countries right now to a past moment in this relationship, what would that be? And is there historical precedent for the point in which the relationship is right now?
Let me start by saying something about my recollection of early trips of newly appointed secretaries in the U.S. I remember vividly, I was working for President Calderon, February 2009, Janet Napolitano, Homeland Security Secretary, came to Mexico. Few weeks later, Hillary Clinton, newly appointed Secretary of State, came to Mexico. The meetings went very well, and they were key for the good communication between Hillary Clinton and our foreign minister, and also with President Calderon. The visit of Hillary Clinton was amazing. She came very well prepared. President Calderon was very well prepared. And for example, during the meeting, we solved a very important issue. Through the Merida Initiative, we were getting some helicopters, Black Hawk helicopters for the Mexican military. They were coming in 2014. President Calderon was leaving office in 2012. Thanks to Hillary, the helicopters came that year, 2009. So these early trips help a lot, especially to understand the complexities of this. To me, the narrative that Mexico needs is that we're the friend, we're the ally, the southern ally, we're not the enemy. So I'm pretty sure that both secretaries will come to Mexico and they will understand, they already getting prepared, the complexities of the relationship with Mexico. I will say I never thought that in my lifetime I would see what I'm seeing. Trump has been amazing. He has created the perfect consensus in Mexico. From the far right to the far left, we all hate Mr. Trump. He made Mexico a political piñata in the election. He made our heroes, the migrants. I mean, he called them things. I mean, so it's, I mean, I will say, and if you want to draw a comparison, I will say, I will compare him to Ambassador Henry Lane Wilson in 2011. This is in the popular imagination in Mexico. Henry Lane Wilson in 1911, he was an ambassador who plotted against the Mexican Revolution, and he plotted against the assassination of Francisco y Madero. I would say we will compare him with President Polk, who sent the US troops to invade Mexico in 1846. I mean, I have never seen this consensus in Mexico. Mexicans are rallying around the flag. And yes, I mean, there's two politicians that have benefited of Trump. Of course, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. I mean, he has increased 7 or 8 points, according to Alejandro Moreno, a pollster that I still trust, because nowadays it's hard to trust a pollster. And I will say, President Peña Nieto has also received a push. Why? Because, I mean, Trump is the public enemy. Not only that, I will say Peña Nieto has found, once again, a sense of purpose. He has given the US-Mexico relationship a sense of urgency. He made a very important change in his cabinet, and I will say his focus. Once he's focused, he has purpose, he's doing fairly well. This is the end. I mean, we're in the 5th year of his administration. The political times are coming to Mexico, but I will say Peña Nieto and AMLO, they have benefited a lot from the way Mexicans hate Mr. Trump.
So perhaps unknowingly unleashed a variety of forces. For folks who don't know, Andrés Manuel López Obrador will be a candidate for the Mexican presidential election, which will occur in mid-2018. Peter, you wanted to jump in there?
I just wanted to underscore that, you know, throughout the history of North America, Mexico, Canada, United States, there have been other polarizing figures. Let's be honest. This may be a new standard. But personal relationships in politics, matter in the extreme. Following on your example, I recall early days in my tenure as foreign minister, meetings with Patricia Espinosa and Secretary Rice. And there have always been outstanding issues, water issues between Canada and the United States, trade issues, softwood lumber, and similarly with Mexico. But the ability to sit down and have an open, honest discourse, develop trust among ministers, not only from the very top, but line departments, U.S. governors, Mexican governors, premiers in Nova Scotia, chambers of commerce, those relationships matter as well. And so I don't think at this early stage we should sound too much alarm. Yes, there has to be pushback. Yes, the early signals and the list of priorities that President Trump has put out there, particularly around trade, are cause for alarm. But I think you're going to see in the coming days, and tomorrow may be a good example of how these ministers make a connection with their opposite number and allow people a little breathing room to step back from some of these positions, because in my estimation, we have to move away from the personal and back to the practical about what is going to pull the economy forward collectively in North America because of the tremendous competition that we will face from Asia Pacific and other parts of the world. We have seen events like Brexit that have also caused tremendous discord and future elections, obviously, in the European Union pose that threat as well. But Theresa May's visit with President Trump is an example of a relationship that could be rekindled in terms of the U.S.-Great Britain relationship. I think it's worth mentioning that the United Kingdom, now as they extricate themselves from the European Union through Brexit, there's a lot of unknowns, but there is a possibility to renew and perhaps establish trade relations with Great Britain for Mexico, Canada, and the United States. And so from every situation comes opportunity.
And there was a very good visit yesterday by the Mexican team, I will say Luis Videgaray, the foreign minister, and the trade minister, Mr. Ildefonso Guajardo. They went to Canada. And there's great news. I mean, apparently, the Canadian foreign minister said, yes, we will go ahead trilaterally. Yeah.
That's right.
Great.
Chrystia Freeland
the
said
news
we won't
was
have a
very
NATO
well
discussion
received
without
in
Mexico.
Mexico. So again, this early visit mattered.
Yeah, and that's important. Paul, I want to go to you on the importance of the North American integrated market, but just a quick follow-up there for you, Peter, on Prime Minister Trudeau's visit last week, right? That there was a lot of concern after that visit about where relations might, a lack of kind of reinforcement of the importance of North America as a whole, and then the Freeland statement about you were showing that NAFTA negotiations must take Canada and Mexico won't negotiate separately, and the importance of NAFTA. So we're seeing kind of different signals, I think, from the Canadian side.
That's right. There was tremendous anxiety in the early days of this presidency. This visit was watched very closely. There, our Prime Minister removed with his arms and legs intact. And many people, there was a lot of rhetoric about this being Bambi meets Godzilla. It didn't happen. It worked out okay. There was a collective sigh of relief. However, there were signals still about NAFTA that were there. There was expressions of concern around the border. We'll deal with them over time. And I think that's the reality. We have to get down to the hard facts, the tremendous advantages that can be laid out in very specific terms of this agreement, and modernizations around things like dispute resolution mechanisms, rules of origin. Those things can be and should be dealt with because of the many changes that have happened since this agreement was put in place.
Paula, there's the value chain integration that is incurred in North America as a result of NAFTA it's not discussed as much, but it's really allowed our global exports to be more economically competitive. So what are the risks to the United States if we break this up? What does this mean for China and for China's position in the world with a less competitive unified North America?
Yeah, well, the integration, which has occurred and accelerated, facilitated by the NAFTA, really started with U.S.-Canada on the auto agreements.
That's right.
Which then became a U.S.-Canada agreement more generally. But autos had dominated, I think, also the NAFTA considerations once the U.S., Canada, and then Mexico got into the final NAFTA. And what we've seen is a dramatic shift in which the automobile industry in this country, which was being battered, if you will, by Japanese competition, was able to steady itself. It engaged not only using the NAFTA rules, but were during the same period saw the increase in technology, which allowed the supply chains to span the borders very, very quickly. There's no question that the technology has had an enormous disruptive effect on manufacturing jobs, and in the United States, and I presume Canada has certainly felt the similar situation. But we in the United States our manufacturing production is higher than it has ever been, but the number of manufacturing jobs is the lowest since the end of World War II.
Right.
So what you've seen is a shift, and the shift also was occurring in Mexico. And so you saw Mexicans who had been eking out a living agriculturally on small plots being attracted to new factories that were being invested in Mexico. So that the combination of the technology, the combination of lower wages in Mexico for these factory jobs, saw the capability of both the auto industry and other manufacturers to compete with the tigers of Asia, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and et cetera. So that has been, I think, a tremendous North American success. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, agriculturally, agriculture, we in the United States enjoy a great surplus. We export around the world, but in particular vis-a-vis Mexico. And that is being, if you will, jeopardized by the future of whether we will have a NAFTA agreement that all three nations can agree to. So we've seen, shifts that are both technological as well as lubricated, if you will, by these NAFTA agreements.
And it's lifted millions of people out of poverty. Let's be frank.
And 14 million jobs that depend on it.
Right. The integration of both economies, and Paul is absolutely right. There are Canadian auto part manufacturers now operating in Mexico very successfully. Yeah. And it has also, and I think others may speak to this much more authoritatively than I, but it has improved labor standards across the board.
Yes.
Yeah. It has had a big impact in terms of bringing people into a more modern, more lucrative quality of life in terms of how they can employ themselves, feed their families, and contribute to their communities.
Meanwhile, we did not deal here at home in the United States adequately with the disruption and the acceleration of the disruption that comes about through the technological dynamism.
Yeah, that's another point. Rafa, go ahead.
Well, I would say that, yes, NAFTA had a lot of spillovers into Mexico, into the relationship, and I would say one of those was environmental norms. Because of NAFTA, Mexico started to really implement the environmental laws, and it has helped Mexico a lot.
Yeah.
So it's not only about trade, it's not only about jobs, but also it's also about, for example, diplomacy. Another very important spillover of NAFTA, it was Mexican diplomacy. Mexico decided to play the Washington game because of NAFTA. We decided to move our embassy from the 16th Street, where now we have a very nice cultural institute, to Pennsylvania Avenue, so that to signify that we're close to the White House, that we're here to affect decisions, and all that is at stake now with Mr. Trump.
But I think one of the big challenges on NAFTA is the fact that nearly 14 million Americans whose jobs depend on NAFTA, most of them probably don't even realize it, or the 5 million that depend on U.S.-Mexico trade because of, as we were saying, the integrated nature of supply chains. That any kind of disruption to this would have severe consequences across the economy, and people just don't necessarily realize it.
Well, if I could just add to that, it's not just the making the stuff; it's also delivering and servicing
the railroads,
and so it is the services as well as manufacturing, which also go into this whole component of a healthy North American economy.
I want to get beyond economics, but I want to before we do that, because I'm in the interest of time, just drill down a little bit more on NAFTA. And in the current environment, Secretary Gutierrez mentioned about not being able to humiliate a country to the negotiating table, the national pride that has now been unleashed in Mexico as a result of discussions. what could be some of the points forward for modernizing NAFTA,
Well,
especially in this current political context?
yes, I mean, I think that the political context is about jobs. And as long as we can see that even though there is increased productivity that comes about, and as long as we have a system in place for helping those who are inevitably disrupted by change, I think it can be a win. But the problem, as I said, is I think we've really neglected that. We haven't talked about human capital. We haven't, and so what Trump really managed to tap into was this neglect. I haven't seen, by the way, however, the president talk about this. And I think that no matter what he negotiated, whatever the terms of a new NAFTA might be, he has got to wrap it into adjustment plans for retraining, community colleges, digital literacy, all the kinds of preparation which his voters and the nation as a whole need. And that's the case in any country, but we are, if you will, been the leader. We are setting the pace now. This is what Trump has put as his number one issue to negotiate these trade agreements. I happen to believe that you could take this old 23-year-old agreement and really pull out the things which were way too controversial from the TPP negotiations and really see that TPP in those 7 years where 12 nations negotiated, dominated, if you will, economically by Canada and the U.S. Together, and Mexico making up, if you will, at least a third of the TPP countries. And that they were able to agree on new rules on environment, new rules on labor. They were able to agree on new rules that had not even existed with regards to services, intellectual property, digital trade, all kinds of matters that had not even been in our minds or adequately politically gelled in our systems a quarter century ago. So I think the president, frankly, could make lemonade out of lemons and quickly borrow where you had seen agreement between the three nations, Canada, U.S., and Mexico already, and really come out and say, I have thought of the future. I'm not just thinking about voters who were disrupted because they had some jobs in manufacturing and they didn't come back when productivity put them out of business.
Of course, he couldn't mention the words that he couldn't say that any of this came from the TPP negotiations themselves, but borrowing a lot of the themes. Now,
But
Peter, let me ask you a question about Canada, right? So there's
Just before that, I mean, the TPP negotiations that were protracted.
Yes.
Similarly, Canada embarked on a comprehensive economic trade agreement with the European Union. A long process, 9 years in its final format. What that tells you, though, is a very important, often unspoken truth, and that is that in all of our countries, Mexico included, we have some very capable professional public servants who have their A game right now when it comes to trade discussions, ready to engage. That helps in the detailed, mature, real, not fake news, discussion about trade. And I think that's going to be very important. You can't negotiate these things in 147 characters. It has to be done.
or 140.
Right, or 140. Maybe the exchange in Canada makes it different.
Right, exactly.
What I'm saying is that we have some really, really capable people, other than just the political figures who will be involved in these discussions. I have a lot of confidence, having spent time in government, in those individuals who are engaged, who are serious, who are doing a lot of the heavy lifting, frankly, out of the glare of the public eye. And I think when we get back to all of these important elements and considerations, we're going to be able to make those improvements.
You're right, Peter. I believe the Mexican team, it has a lot of experience. I mean, some of them, they've been there, as Ildefonso Guajardo, the secretary, for 25 years. He was a NAFTA negotiator, so he has lots of experience. Then he went into politics, so now he's a seasoned politician as well as a very good negotiator. And of course, they were negotiating TPP. By the way, Canada and Mexico, they team up a lot during TPP, sometimes off and on to balance the US power. So it seems to me that that's why to remain trilateral will be so important for
The
for
challenge-
I
the challenge on
want to
the
reinforce on that trilateral. I really think it's so important, and therefore Canada plays an incredibly important role here. Canada, for
It is
you
the
know, is,
pivot,
is,
I would
is
say.
pivotal
Yep.
because this will set the stage for the next 25 years or 50 years. What is our trade architecture? Our trade architecture, which has been a winning architecture since the end of World War II, was to make win-wins and to increase the economic pie, if you will, by reducing the barriers at the border, very briefly. But Canada is so important and played such an important role. I think of Sylvia Ostry, who is had led the charge for so many years intellectually in Canada to assure that Canada was part of the Quad. What was the Quad? That was US, Japan, Europe, and Canada that pushed, if you will, many of the rules of the road, commercial rules of the road, at the World Trade Organization and its predecessor, the GATT. Now, those rules of the road have brought us to the kind of economic level that we have had today. But again, I want to emphasize that's not enough. Each of our nations have to worry about those who were disrupted by this turbocharged economic system that we are in, new business models, new digital world. But on the trade side, and that's why I say it's just microeconomics, and it's just really smart negotiators. But it's essential, but it's not enough.
Trade architecture is there, so the skeleton is there, very strongly.
has
The bones are there.
Right. Gotta
Some of the
keep it.
same individuals. We've seen our former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney emerge very prominently in this discussion around NATO. He attended the meeting yesterday, attended by the Mexican Foreign Secretary and Chrystia Freeland, spoke very positively, said they're going to be difficult negotiations, as they were in the beginning.
Yeah.
And I do come back to an often referred to expression about security trumping trade, and that's taken on a whole new meaning. But Canada has this existing NORAD relationship, our NATO relationship, our G7 relationship with the United States of America. But we also have tremendous ties with Mexico that go back decades as well. Of
course.
You mentioned the Auto Pact. But this is a relationship that it has been cultivated. It has ebbed and flowed. But I put a lot of faith in the leadership as well as those professional public servants. Not only NAFTA, but the Acid Rain Treaty is another example that would not have happened were it not for the personal relationship between Ronald Reagan and Brian Mulroney.
I want Peter, I want to get back to NAFTA again, the specifics of from the Canadian perspective. That there's a lot of folks here in this room are very familiar with what the Trump administration wants out of NAFTA, the potential modifications. But from the Canadian side as well, when NAFTA is open to be modernized, there's a number of things in the agreement that are not serving Canada's interests well, and that Canada is going to be coming to the negotiating table to fight for changes. What are some of those?
Well, one of them, I suspect, will be access to some of the infrastructure projects that are going to be presented. I mean, this is yet to be really unpacked in terms of how that will impact the American economy, but there seems to be a lot of indications that there will be restrictions placed on Mexican and Canadian participation in infrastructure building. They're going to need labor. They're going to need Canadian softwood lumber, other products that will be part of building the infrastructure that President Trump has spoken to. Let's not forget that he's a businessman, a contractor. I think he owns a golf course. He's going to, I think,
One or two at least.
quickly come to the realization that you can't go it alone in the enormity of the type of infrastructure that he's speaking about. The dispute resolution mechanism has also been contentious. We've seen it break down over the 30 years in the Canada-U.S. relationship. But you know, I guess putting on my justice hat for a moment, it strikes me that pulling back from the independent dispute resolution mechanism that's entrenched in NAFTA and going to the American courts may not be the best idea. You have to be careful what you ask for, as we've seen in recent decisions coming from your courts. So the independent arm's length dispute resolution mechanism, I think, has worked well overall. You know, changing the rules of the game significantly at this point is where we'll get bogged down. If it's tweaking, if it's updating, modernizing, including things like IP
And currency manipulation.
and currency
is gonna
manipulation,
be a
those things
major issue.
can be worked out.
Now, Rafael, what are some of the U.S.-Mexico relations we're talking about extends far beyond NAFTA, right? Incredible amounts of intelligence sharing, cooperation at the U.S.-Mexico border as well as at the Mexico-Guatemala border. El Chapo was extradited to the United States just the week before President Trump took office. Just a huge amount of cooperation at the agency level, as we were talking about before, between governors and mayors and whatnot. What are some of the cards that Mexico could potentially play to hold its position vis-a-vis the United States with regard to the NAFTA discussions?
I would say very important one, the strategic one is, I would say that the Northern Triangle of Central America, Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, it really has become a Syria of the Americas. I mean, the levels of violence in El Salvador is like Syria. And the level of, I mean, the lack of economic opportunity is like Syria. So I believe that Mexico is the essential partner of the U.S. to try to control that problem and to improve Central America, especially the Northern Triangle. Let's put it this way. Out of 10 Central Americans living in Central America, and by the way, the last 2 years, what we call the OTMs, other than Mexicans, there's more OTMs trying to come into the U.S. through the Mexican border than Mexicans. So the flow of Central America is now larger than the Mexicans, and we could discuss why is that. But so far, out of 10 Central Americans trying to come to the U.S., Mexico is deporting 5, the U.S. is deporting 3, and 2 are making it into the U.S. So Mexico is a key ally on that. So strategically, I mean, I don't see a way for the U.S. come in and try to improve conditions in Central America without Mexico. So again, we're a key ally. Then I will say, economically speaking, I will say especially the 4 border states, California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, for them, the top export destination is Mexico. Those 4 states made 25% of the U.S. economy. California is huge. So I don't see those 4 states without NAFTA. So it seems to me that I mean, the border states will come to Mexico. I believe time is on behalf, I mean, it will help Mexico because the natural allies of Mexico will come out. That's how we see. And so far, the narrative is that we will renegotiate NAFTA. We know it's going to take time. In terms of Canada, we'll see an ambivalence in Canada. We have the Mulroneys of Canada, which he is a champion. And Canada in the 1980s, was a champion of globalization. Because of Canada, we have an accession clause in the last chapter of NAFTA to get in third countries. No one came, but there's there. And Canada was the champion. Nowadays, I'm sorry, but I mean, we have also Stephen Harper, what I don't see, he was a champion of globalization. He imposes visas on Mexican nationals in a terrible time for Mexico in 2009 in the midst of the H1N1 crisis that, by the way, that was a North American crisis because the number of people having H1N1 was very alarming, not only in Mexico, but in the entire North America. If you look at a map, and if you look at the cities with more than 500 people infected, you'll see that North America was all on red. So that, why was that? Well, because of the connectivity between Canada, the US, and Mexico. So the connectivity is there, but there's some conservative people in Canada. There's people that they prefer the bilateral way. To me, that's short-sighted because we have a lot to win. When we negotiated NAFTA, there were about only 40 regional agreements, trade regional agreements. Nowadays, there's almost 300. So now the world is basically trading regionally speaking. So North America could be very strong if the three remain there, but we don't know yet. I'm
Diversifying your
sometimes
trade
optimistic,
agreement.
sometimes negative about Canada, because I know there's a lot of stake to Canada, but I believe that we have a lot to gain, Canada and Mexico, especially in trying to balance Mr. Trump. And if we don't remain together, I don't think we have the power to balance.
Rafa, you mentioned the 4 border states which support over 1 million U.S. jobs because of the U.S.-Mexico ties. And at the Latin America Center here, we've been in the midst of a Why Mexico initiative where we have a number of different social media tiles and other things. And one of our tiles you probably saw before coming in today's event was not only is it those 4 border states, but there's over 30 states that have Mexico as a number 1 or number 2 trade partner. And on that point,
and I think you should put agriculture. I mean, I don't think we
That's very
talked
important.
about.
Right. Well, that's my question to you, Paula.
Oh,
And I
good.
actually,
Okay.
question for you, and then I want to open up to
said it.
questions from the audience. So please start thinking of your questions. Want to make sure that we have time to address the number of questions out there. But Paula, my question to you is on industries in the United States. What would be some of the industries in the United States that would suffer greatest from any type of not only breaking apart of NAFTA or from moving toward bilateral with Mexico? How would this? You mentioned agriculture. What are some of the other industries that would be most severely affected? The American workers that would be most severely affected.
Well, that's 2 different things because as I really want to emphasize that when it comes to manufacturing, the numbers of jobs in a successfully global sector will be reduced. We will see robots where there might have been people before.
Yeah.
So you will increase and see increasing production and shipments and exports, but you may not see the concomitant increase in jobs in those particular situations. Electronics. We see it every day with televisions, flat panel displays, the assembly of every electronic factories that are assembling and doing value added as well in Mexico. But often with the semiconductors and the very high value added input that may be reflective of American U.S. values, I should say, value added, coming across the border, not just once, but 2 or 3 different times before you finally see the assembled product. And so, if you disrupt that, I think we basically, as a continent, as a continental economy, will lose to competition in Asia. And I think that's across the board. And as far as the agricultural goods, I mean, we've heard from already the Texas cattlemen. You said if you wait long enough, Rafael, that you'll start to see others who will push back. And you're already hearing Texas cattlemen who are basically got their, some of their cattle on the other side of the border and moving back and forth and coming back as steaks. And likewise, of course, corn, and we are already seeing the threat to our agricultural sectors here in the United States, and the representatives speaking out and speaking up now, concerned that Mexico is indeed shopping in Argentina, Brazil, elsewhere
It is.
for the corn. That had been really responsible for much of our exports and our export numbers. So they are not many jobs, again, particularly in the agricultural area. But I don't think we can afford to shoot ourselves in the foot, if you will, by unwinding all of the progress that we have made. Yes, there need to be done to deal with the anxiety, but it's, and yes, we can upgrade the trade agreement, but we should, I feel, be seeing this as an opportunity to expand and not come back with a fallback position that will
I want to,
reduce.
Peter, give you a quick word and then open up to questions from the audience.
Well, that's why the talk of border tax right now is unhelpful. But that's not to say that the U.S. Congress and Senate aren't going to have a lot to say about these negotiations as they progress.
Constitutionally, they're entitled.
And absolutely, and the pillars of the checks and balances in your country are very strong. But
Yes.
one of the areas that we haven't touched on that I think will figure prominently is energy, and talk of pipelines.
Right.
And this affects all three countries in North
Yes.
America. Being energy independent in America is one thing. Being North American energy independent, in my view, should be the goal. And the way to achieve that is closer cooperation. That also includes closer cooperation around climate change, around the environment, around emission standards. Because, you know, we're yet to see what the president is going to do with the Paris Climate Change Accord. It's a pretty clear signal that's coming already that there's a backing away from that, as we saw with Kyoto. That's problematic, because if we're not holding to account China, Pakistan, India, ourselves, we're whistling past a graveyard on some of these important environmental issues. We've got to be working together on that. Going it alone in that area is disaster.
And on energy, U.S. energy exports to Mexico could in and of themselves erase the trade deficit that we have with Mexico if we just leave things alone.
And energy is not covered in our
I'm
trade
going to
agreements.
stop the panel for a moment because I want to make sure that we have questions from the audience here.
Good.
Because I'm sure we have many. And there'll be microphones circulating. I see Diana Negroponte. If you could just introduce your name and your question. And I'm actually going to take I'll take three questions together. The first question here in the second row, Roberta.
Thank you very much. If the problem is I'm Diana Negroponte from the Woodrow Wilson Center. If the key political problem is jobs, is there within the NAFTA the capacity to raise additional revenues to invest in the skills retraining which we need to meet the new economy?
Great, thank you. I'm going to take a couple questions together because there's many questions. I think the next hand I saw was in the middle of the third row, and then I'm going to go to you, sir, in the, I think, probably 10th row on that side.
Hi, Brett Fortnum with Inside U.S. Trade. How will the idea of renegotiating NAFTA bilaterally with separate negotiations happening between Canada and Mexico, how will that impact how that renegotiation is going to happen? I mean, is that a realistic way to do so? I mean, how could you deal with issues such as rules of origin in that fashion? And there's also been a lot of talk about other issues cropping up, the border adjustability tax, immigration. I mean, is it possible that those other areas kind of poison the well in terms of this renegotiation, that they overshadow any possible update with NAFTA?
Okay, thanks. And then I saw a question all the way back in the right side of the about middle.
Hi, Kirk Scher with Clearview Strategy Group. I'd like to ask the flip side of the question that Diana Negroponte asked, and that is, from the Mexican point of view, there's a lot of concern that wage growth over the past 20 years hasn't been adequate. So the flip side of the jobs equation there is lack of wage growth. How would a renegotiation address that?
Okay, thanks, Kirk. Let me start off with Paul. Would you like to? There's a question. Diana's question: is there capacity in NAFTA for funding for greater worker capacity building? The questions on the impact of going bilaterals rather than the multilateral, and could there be other issues, the cloud discussion, and then Kirk's question about the lack of wage growth in Mexico and how that is part of the discussions. I'll start with you, Paula.
You are right to put this together. The need to deal with the adjustment that comes from trade. There has never been, if you will, a tax or that has been kind of put aside. Talk about the wall and how the wall that President Trump wants to build, he has suggested that with a 35% tariff on Mexico's goods, that he could pay for the wall, if you will. But that means you're taking money out of the American consumer's pocket when you take it out that way in a tariff. So what your challenge is to the Congress and to the President when it comes to allocating funds for this. And there are many excellent proposals that academics have made that deal with both wage insurance or various ways of assisting those who are impacted not only by changes from trade, but changes from technology. But Congress has never shown a willingness to allocate those kinds of funds. And as you know, we as a nation compared to other industrialized nations basically think that, you know, the individual should kind of deal with these disruptions. And I happen to believe that has brought about the toxic situation that we saw in this last election. And I think that bigger competitiveness agenda, the bigger bargain, is something which I think you have to turn back to President Trump and ask, now, what are you going to do in addition to just going back to trade negotiations? But you've got to remember that the role of the consumer here when it comes to allocating a new tax or a new tariff for this.
Peter, you want to answer the question on the impact of bilaterals, and then Rafael on wage growth in Mexico?
Mm-hmm. Just very briefly, though, to Ms. Negroponte's question about skills training, job training, I don't believe in the reading of the original Canada-US and brought it out to NAFTA in '93 that it did really envision the impact of technology and that sector, not only in automation, but just the number of jobs. And as the Secretary said, this is an area of modernization, I think, that should happen and will happen in the negotiation. Thank you, by the way. The Woodrow Wilson Institute does remarkable work on these exact issues and has been a great friend to Canada. On the negotiation, the signal that came very clearly from Foreign Minister Chrystia Freeland yesterday was that we're not going to throw Mexico under the bus. This is not going to be a go-it-alone bilateral. However, having made that declaration, a lot will depend, of course, on the signals from the White House. It's easy to make that declaratory statement. The concern will be the propensity of the president to prefer, his stated preference is bilateral type relations in trade negotiations. And, you know, going back to square one, he wants to win. He wants America to come out with at least 51% better than whoever he's negotiating with. And so if that's if that means starting way over here and making quite extreme statements to get back to middle ground, that's a negotiating tactic. That's not new, but it's certainly part of the president's personality, if I can say that, and he's going to negotiate hard. Canada and Mexico are going to have to come to the table with clearly enunciated positions, well articulated, well backed up with facts, and let the negotiating begin.
Let me say three things. First of all, there's an emerging consensus in Mexico, in every circle, that if Trump were to denounce NAFTA, it would not be the end of the world for Mexico. Why is that? Because we will have the WTO. Then tariffs for Mexican exports to the U.S. will raise between 2 and 3%, mostly 2%. So it's not the end of the world.
Except on the small trucks.
But still, I mean, but then on small trucks, it cut both ways, because then the U.S. auto industry will have a tough time.
Scream.
I mean, the Ford and General Motors, they would, out of business. So that's one. Second, I would say, you're right. I mean, the gap between Mexican salaries and U.S. salaries hasn't been breached, hasn't been closed in the last 20 years. NAFTA hasn't done much. But if you take another index, for example, the Human Development Index, you will see that Mexico is really bridging the gap between the US in the last 20 years. What is that? Why is that? Well, because education has increased a lot in Mexico, and also health. Now, about 95 million of Mexicans are covered by Seguro Popular, by this very low but important health insurance. So this is a new Mexico, and also because of that, I mean, you'll see. I mean, there's been a lot of Mexicans coming back. Some of them unwillingly because of deportation, but some of them because if you don't have health here, if you don't have education services here, they better go back to Mexico. So that helps to explain why in the last 7 years there's been zero net migration of Mexicans into the U.S. And but you're right. The good thing about renegotiating NAFTA is that now we have to have, I mean, a labor agreement within NAFTA, and then we really could talk about salaries. There's a new emerging consensus in Mexico. The mayor of Mexico City, I mean, he's been talking about raising the minimum wage in Mexico City. He's getting somewhere, and I will say, but now you're listening about this from every single political side. You finally listen the Treasury Minister of Mexico talking about this, and we all know that we have to bridge that gap between Mexico and the U.S. Let's face it, if we compare the salaries between the auto industry, here in the U.S. is about $20 per hour, and in Mexico is $2 per hour. We know that that's not fair. We have to change that. But then, I mean, we believe that we have to update NAFTA, and we could see this as an opportunity for updating that.
But I would also say too that NAFTA has helped to lift the boats of all Mexicans, right? I mean, there's still, of course, there's wage disparity just given the nature of the two economies and just the dramatic difference from the get-go, right? But we have to realize that our relationship with Mexico is not a zero-sum game, right? That lifting the boats of Mexicans helps the United States and it helps North America. You want a more prosperous country just on your southern border, and so I think that's important to take into account. I have a piece coming out in National Review that talks as well about Mexican education. You have more engineers now graduating in Mexico than you do in Germany. I mean, there has been significant educational advances, significant advances in technology. We did a report at the Latin America Center last year on innovation in Mexico, and Guadalajara is an innovation hub. So lots of interesting things are happening. We have 4 more minutes. We want to end on time, so I want to take 2 more questions. I saw in the about middle, Simon, about middle way, and then sir, your question here in the third row. We'll take those quickly.
Thank you, Simon Whistler from Control Risks. A question, so what is achievable? What is genuinely achievable in terms of negotiations, and not taking just NAFTA into account, but also the broader immigration and border security issues and the like, because you can't, although we focused heavily on NAFTA, the two are going to be inevitably intertwined. And I asked that specifically in the context of the political objectives, specifically of both the US and Mexico, of any negotiations, and also the time frames available. We talked about AMLO a little bit, but the election campaign in Mexico starts in earnest very, very soon. So that's inevitably going to have a huge impact on the way Mexico approaches these negotiations. So what is genuinely achievable as a result of that?
Thank you. Then, sir, here in the third row.
Hi, Rafael Bernal from The Hill. I'll make this quick. Mexico opened consultations on NAFTA. Is this jumping the gun, or is this getting a head start?
Okay, great. So what's individual towards negotiations in Mexico opening up its consultations? Rafael, why don't I start with you? If you can keep your response to about 30 seconds.
Yeah, what I would like to say is that the Mexican negotiators now, they are under a lot of pressure. This is a sharp difference from the 1990s when we negotiated NAFTA. I mean, then we have a unique party system. We had an authoritarian system. Nowadays, the Senate is very much there. For example, a Mexican senator, along with another 10 senators, Armando Rios Peter, an independent senator, he just put a bill in the Senate about substituting the U.S. The corn that we import from the U.S. That is really caught in the eye of, for example, of Senator Chuck Grassley, and he said we have to be careful with Mexico. Yeah. So again, I mean, there's ways for Mexico to proceed, and the important thing that there's a consensus that we can live without NAFTA. Hopefully that will not be the case. But if this is a negotiating position of Mr. Trump, seems to me that Mexico has now a good response because we know that we can live and survive without NAFTA.
Paula, what's achievable in terms of NAFTA?
I think this, the fact is that President Trump taught us that, again, you know, that he or she who shapes the debate wins the debate. And he made this election about trade, and now he's making this discussion here today about a trade agreement. And I believe that with enough people in place, civil servants and skilled people, that we can see, as I said earlier, lemonade out of lemons. But I think the president is going to increasingly have to hear from members of Congress who in turn are hearing from their constituents how they are being impacted. And we're for the first time in a long time, the CEOs have become incredibly outspoken about immigration on this H-1B visa stuff, the tech companies and the financial companies. We got to see the same CEOs start talking along with the agricultural multinationals about what this can mean if we do not get a successful
an imperative
NAFTA.
because the business community has been relatively silent up to this
very
point. Peter,
silent.
I'll give you the last word.
Well, a world without NAFTA is a much more difficult world for all three countries. But I agree with the fact that, you know, all three countries are going to go into these negotiations with their own very specific issues, and on some things we may have to part company. But that doesn't undermine the fact that the overall agreement can be improved. Security is inseparable. Immigration is going to be inseparable. Labor mobility. I mean, this is why Canada has a much more diversified trade relationship. Under Stephen Harper, we negotiated 30-some trade agreements, including the CETA, which allows a country of 37 million people to have access to a 500 million person European Union economy. So that's not to suggest we can go it alone, but it is to suggest that you need to diversify your trade relations. That's what Mexico is doing as well. TPP, while dead for the United States, is not dead for Canada. So there are other trade relationships that can factor into this as well, including bringing the UK into a North American trade relationship.
Yeah. Well, I want to end by thank my colleagues in the Latin America Center, Juan Felipe Celia, who put this event together, and Andrea Murta, our deputy director, as well as the entire Latin America Center team and the events team here at the Atlantic Council, and to thank Secretary Gutierrez for his very insightful remarks, and again, Secretary, for your leadership on these issues. My colleague Peter Schechter opened the event, and of course this incredibly esteemed all-star panel, Peter MacKay, Paula Stern, and Rafael Fernandez de Castro. And of course, all of you for joining us today. We will, as Peter said at the outset, this is an issue that is incredibly important for the Atlantic Council and for the Latin America Center, and we will be continuing to have events and publications and other types of social media awareness about the importance of the Mexico relationship in North America overall. So thank you all for being with us today.